Hi, everybody. Welcome to Written and Watched, where we read a book and talk about it, and then we watch the movie and talk about it. I am your host, Justin Libernet, and with me today is Anthony Vernon. Anthony, welcome to Written and Watched. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me. This is a lot of fun for me as someone who got a minor in film and just has an absolute love for literature. So yeah, I'm super excited about this. I guess to give very quick background, I'm a regularly published literary writer and a adjunct professor at a couple of schools in South Florida. So that's the basics.
I think that qualifies. I think you might be a little bit more qualified than I am for this one. Although I will say I was surprised by your choice. So today we're doing When Nietzsche Wept, which honestly I was surprised it wasn't called Thus Wept Nietzsche.
Yes, or just Thus Wept. Yes, good reference.
So what brought you, what made you want to bring this book back up? It was published in 1992. The guy that wrote it was born in the 30s. So, it has a pretty long pedigree and a long tail into psychological consciousness. So what about this text?
Well, I think you kind of hinted at it. One, there's a lot of resurgence of psychology in regards to being of high interest in the same way as it was in its initial founding. I mean, there's just a lot more reference to therapy. There's a lot of growth in sort of therapeutic industries, a lot more people studying psychology for one, a lot of people going to Stoic podcasts. And then that same sort of vein of Stoic podcasts, the other figure that has come to rise in kind of recent history is Nietzsche himself. He's gained a lot of resurgence in a lot of internet circles. I mean, the number of accurate and inaccurate YouTube videos about Nietzsche is just astounding in a way that I would not have expected when I first did sort of my own studying upon Nietzsche at the beginning of my master's program. At this point, 3-4-ish years ago, and just, when I started studying Nietzsche, there was very little content out there on Nietzsche. And just in the last 4 years, he's exploded almost in a similar way to Stoic content. Not obviously as big, but his name is even starting to appear in some of these outlets and channels.
And for me, I was surprised I'd never heard of this text before because I did philosophy for my undergrad, except I was pretty focused on ethics and kind of, and then some metacognition stuff, but ethics was my core. And so I really came up through the Manichaean ethics and then Kant and, utilitarianism and all that jazz.
So I kind of ethics tree. That's
this will be great.
I'm into all the subjective stuff ethically. So this is fantastic sort of difference here.
Yeah. But then my master's degree, I got in psychology. And so when I was in that, I've studied Freud, I've gone back through there, but I never realized that there was such a tight overlap in the German intellectual circles. Yeah. That all these people kind of intertwined, which is fascinating.
Well, I mean, this work itself is a work of historical fiction, but at the end of his kind of writing days, Freud started reading Nietzsche, maybe or maybe not at the behest of Jung. It's hard to really know how he got into it, but he famously said of Nietzsche that there was no man who understood his own mind better than Nietzsche. And so Freud, while writing his magnum opus and magnum opuses, because he's just that impactful. But when writing most of his major works, he had no influence under Nietzsche directly. Only in this later life did he examine Nietzsche in the same way that Confucius didn't examine the I Ching till like the end of his life. So it's one of these sort of situations, whereas Jung very much ties in Nietzsche, like throughout, like early on, like he's very early on inspired by the works and words of Nietzsche.
Yeah, and so this novel takes place right in the end of the 19th century. It's 1870s-ish is when we're taking place, right?
80s, kind of.
1880s.
Yeah, right before, well, at least according to the film for sure. I'm not sure if the book makes it as explicit about when he writes. This is before Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and this is after Human, All Too Human. So we're in the late 1880s.
And we're only about 10, 15 years removed then from the formation of the German Second Reich, right? So Wilhelm is now on, and they've actually joined Northern and Southern Germany. So it's one of the things in German history too that has a huge bearing on the psyche of its people and kind of the behaviors too. And I think that comes out in this book a lot, is how formal and how structured parts of German society were.
Yeah. We're pretty deep in the Victorian age, for sure at this point. Right. I mean, given the kind of the British global dominance at that time and its cultural influence on the rest of the world. I mean, in combination with the sort of, the Prussian sort of ruling state that kind of unified Germany, and its rigid militaristic formalness really created for a Germany with a lot of codes and formal customs, as no doubt multiple times, like Dr. Brewer, like, sort of the, hidden language of Vienna and the hidden codes and formalities of Vienna. But yeah, this is very true for all the German-speaking states. Obviously, Vienna was not part of the Reich, given that it's Austro-Hungarian, but there was still that sort of global influence of global social conservatism, at least pushed by Europe.
Yeah, fair. Okay, so before we get into the plot, do you want to introduce the cast of characters, like our core group, and highlight who's real? Because most of them are real people.
They're all real people. They're just all fictionalized kind of together. There's a lot of speculative work happening here. But Nietzsche is not the main character, which is also one of the fascinating things about this. The main character is one Dr. Brewer, who was a mentor of Freud's and in general was a medical doctor. So we have him as kind of the main sort of figure, the main person has to overcome. His foil is Nietzsche in a sense. They are in a weird way kind of enemies to like lovers type situation where like at first there's like some conflict and but then they get along, but there's conflict. So it's like Nietzsche is a foil to Brewer and Brewer is a foil to Nietzsche. He ultimately overcomes his adversary Nietzsche. You have, and then really kind of, I guess, tertiary is Freud as sort of an advisor to Dr. Brewer. Lou Salome is sort of the person who gets the ball rolling. You have sort of, Anna O is kind of the other important character as a object for desire for Dr. Brewer. And then Dr. Brewer's kind of family, I count as one character because they're not really well embodied. They're kind of just a unit of thing he has to return to. They're the kind of return to home part of the hero's journey.
I'd say his wife and kids are pretty just the wall, like they're the family.
Right.
But I will say that he does have a couple of interactions with his brother-in-law Max.
Yes.
Who has a different kind of foil for him and kind of helps push him through some of the issues that he bumps into. And he does sit way down on the list, but he is more developed than the family is by far, much more than Matilda and any of that.
Yeah, it kind of has that kind of, 1930s kind of like conservatism of like the family is sort of a cultural block and unit put together, not a cast of individualistic characters. And it's these, intelligent people that are truly the guiding force for this man to return to his home and stability that like you use. Like intelligent men are under the labor of questioning their lives, but and it's these dumb family people that like really allow for that stability so the work can carry on. Kind of attitude is kind of brought here, especially at the end, which I don't want to spoil or allude to too much.
Yep, I think too that's interesting because the character of Joseph Brewer, he is Jewish and he marries into Jewish wealth, and so his wife has more money that brings into the dowry than he starts with. But then he sets up a very successful practice. But in that, the family makes the home, and he goes out and struggles with ideas. There's echoes of that very deeply in Jewish culture and society, where there's a lot of stress put on, especially extremely fundamental Jews, where they go, your job is to figure out the Torah, your job is to think and research, and we're here, we're going to make the home, we're going to have the food, we're going to take care of stuff, so you can just focus on that. And I saw some echoes of that in that structure, which is why he's kind of out there going, I have full control of my schedule, and when I need to think about things, I get to go stand back, I got to do my thinking.
Yeah, and you could see Nietzsche almost borrowing from this Jewish attitude, not just in the text, but in real life, that he has his relationship to Judaism is actually mostly positive in regards to individuals themselves, just not the system which they came up with. He praises the resiliency of people holding on to ideas. That's the main thing he likes about the culture. But, in regards, obviously he has a lot of critiques, and there seems to be something with Nietzsche here. He at once is a complicated man who wants to praise and admire constant thinking, and is a man of thinking more than action, but excuse me, wants to be a person of action first and foremost, right? So he has this conflict within himself, just in real life and in this book, between his ability to go about praxis versus thought. And he obviously tends towards thought as a thinking and a stickly thinking man, and, kind of envies Brewer in a sense of being able to commit to actions, but also sees Brewer as someone who's not seizing, right? Like for Nietzsche, it's like, I would do more if I were in, sort of your shoes. Like I would, act out more if I had the ability. So there's that tension too, where it's like, where Nietzsche would do very different things in Brewer's position, and probably more physical things, but he feels forced into this life of thinking, whereas Dr. Brewer kind of chooses this life of thinking because he could have gone, as a more traditional doctor. He's called out time and time again for being, overly heady and thoughtful of patients and taking on patients that the rest of Vienna would not even consider.
Well, and we're at a point too in this, and I think there's a couple of points in the text where they talk about it too, where the evolution of medicine is kind of like 40, 50 years into actually being kind of formalized with institutions, with places to go. You've got Kellogg stateside kind of doing that. Mm-hmm. And then over in Vienna and Austria and a lot of the German spaces, they're formalizing all of these procedures, diagnoses, and stuff. And the one that keeps coming up in the text for that is their discussion of hysteria.
Yes.
And the original idea of hysteria was that, the uterus is running around inside the lady, making her crazy. And they admonished that viewpoint in the book, that we were so naive to have thought that, and start to go, it's not moving, but then why does hysteria only happen to women? And so they've shifted their discussion of the issue. And I think that's a very interesting place, because that's exactly where medicine was at that time. They're casting off all of these kind of superstitious modalities and starting to get into the science and experimentation of it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think, though, that may be an over, emphasis on, the people of the past were less rational and weren't diagnoses. I mean, it wasn't as systematized. It wasn't as logarithmic. But, certainly there was, casting of assuasions in the old hospital system in terms of hospice, right, where that term sort of comes from in the medieval ages. And, if anything, it's a switch to sort of pathologizing as opposed to, well, funny enough, demonizing, right, that would sometimes occur in the Middle Ages, not as much as people think. But in that sort of regard, right, there's a lot of pathology going on here. And because, and this is one of the things I think the book does well, this pathologizing of, diseases slips into the self-pathologizing, right, where every sort of organ can be pathologized, including the organ of thought, right? There isn't, neuropsychology, neuroscience isn't developed yet. And the majority position in the world in terms of the mind-body problem at this point is Descartes' dualism, even though it's kind of beat down by Elizabeth of Bohemia. Nonetheless, the mind is seen as a separate organ for everybody but Nietzsche. Like Nietzsche, even in this text, Nietzsche very much shows his assuasion towards mind-body monism, that the mind is a bodily thing. But you kind of have even Freud. And,
so wait, let's pause right there for some of the listeners, because that dualism and stuff he's talking about is the idea that your spirit or your subconscious or your soul is almost a homunculus that's driving this meat body puppet, and so there's this separation into two pieces. And Descartes' cogito kind of is that thing where he's identifying the thing that thinks is, and then we don't really. The body is this meat puppet that informs it. It's like a probe pushed into the world.
I like how it's put. I also like using anime metaphors, right? Think of like Neon Genesis, where it's like the mind is the pilot and the body is the the Avas. So I think
that's a good one. I like that one.
Yeah. When I teach mind body dualism, I love using, I use Dragon Ball Z and I use Code Geass and my Chainsaw Man. There we go. I can't believe I almost forgot that one. But thank you for pausing there. So and I think that's where a lot of these unconscious conversations come in, where Brewer doesn't want to admit that there's this unconscious thing because, he calls it homunculus multiple times even. As you said before, he calls it platonic. So, there's this sort of even debate on the nature of the mind in the book, which this book really does a lot of work. And even though it's a historical fiction, it really touches upon a lot of real things that were happening.
Yeah. And I think that comes through because the author is so learned, deep, and has been pushed through all this. And hold on, I'm grabbing his name because I just forgot it. Irvin Yalom.
Yes.
If I'm saying that right.
Yes.
Irvin Yalom.
Studied philosophy initially, moved into psychology. So someone who studied both fields very acutely.
Definitely crossed that bridge and kind of came into it for sure. And that's very apparent in the text. So now that you've got kind of an idea of the people that are involved, even though they're fantasy portrayals of historically accurate people, and the discussions in it are philosophically and psychologically extremely intriguing, well written, and kind of a nice. It's like a bunch of people being students and kind of talking through these ideas. But all that kind of happens, and I feel like the plot is in service to getting those discussions on the page.
Yeah, it's certainly good at informing the beliefs of these individuals, but in a large sense, you're kind of right. It's almost like a dialogue in action, right? Like, it has more plot happening than your typical Socratic dialogue, but in large part, most of this text is reading through discussions between various individuals in various places. And they're not uninteresting discussions, and they have a level of realism to them more than a Socratic dialogue would for sure. But it's basically the plot is an excuse to, share ideas and notions. The conflict here is a very, mental conflict as opposed to, shoot, he got shot, right? Like there's no like major events that happen in this text. So if you like an action-based text, this isn't your text. But if you like a text that makes you think, this is a really good one.
Agreed. And I'd almost argue there's two books in here. Mm-hmm. One is just like the general plot and the structure of there's probably 5 or 6 beats in that whole thing. And those 5 or 6 beats play out, and you could condense that into like a 20-page work. The other 150 pages in here, 120 pages, are pretty much arguments for and against various ways of thinking about the mind, thinking about the problems. And you're kind of watching the psychological talking method get developed, right? Like it's kind of like it feels like it's informing what Freud's going to do later.
But there is a running theme for sure. Like I think separating the two you could do, but the main running theme, at least in my opinion, is desire, right? And it's trying to touch upon how, the main need for this form of therapy is desire. It's almost a sort of answer to like Buddhism in a sense, where it's like, oh, the problem is desire. The problem is desire, or maybe to Schopenhauer, who is also relevant in the zeitgeist and whose name gets mentioned a couple of times. Sort of this, how do we handle our desires? And for these individuals, they come up with psychoanalysis as the way in which to deal with our desires, be they be lustful desires, be they be desires of adventure, intellectualism, but mainly the main desire really dealt with here is the desire of lust. That's kind of the main thing that, 3 of the men here deal with, Brewer, Nietzsche, and Freud to a lesser degree, which is only made obvious in sort of a lesser line, where Freud talks about his own wife being made as he picked his own wife as a model based off Brewer's wife. He's like, oh, I want someone that's like, your wife. And so even Freud's desire is touched upon, but not made very explicit. But throughout here, it is just a series of desire happening again and again.
I think I missed that bit on Freud's desire. I remember him talking about
chapter
his
3.
wife when he was talking about Matilda. So I'll jump back in and look at that.
Yeah, it's in chapter 3. Very subtle.
The other two are pretty overt. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so to frame it up, the whole thing opens up in it's in Venice, right? So they're in Italy at the start of it.
They're in Vienna at the start, I believe.
Are they in Vienna?
I just missed that detail. I mean, that's like would be a very deep opening detail to miss out. But the location, I don't think is that important. Where Lou Salome confronts Dr. Brewer.
Yeah, so they're The reason I think it's not Vienna is because they were staying in a hotel. And she's watching out the window for him. And so I know it's not Vienna, and I thought it was Venice, but it may be somewhere else in Germany too, or Austria or something. But Dr. Brewer at the open is approached in a cafe by an enchantingly beautiful woman who is dominant and direct and says, "Hey, I need your help to save the future of German philosophy." Like that's the opener that she drops on him. Do you want to kind of talk through those notes in the beginning, the main plot beats, just so we can get them out of the way and talk about philosophy?
Yeah, I think, so in regards, she comes up to Dr. Brewer, says, "Hey, can you save the future of philosophy?" And the only reason Dr. Brewer does this is because of his desire for Lou Salome. He's like, "Oh, this girl's hot and aggressive and intelligent. Like, yeah, let's go, baby. I just got to deal with this Nietzsche guy. Whatever. Like, she's probably exaggerating, whatever. Like, but it's interesting nonetheless." So he sees Nietzsche and, he's just been told, "Oh my God, this is the future of German philosophy. This guy's a big deal." Yes, he was only a professor for a little bit. Don't worry about that. But he's the future. And he sees the guy and he sees just this man who is just clearly depressed. And it's just like not, with it. And it's just like, oh, okay, whatever. But as he talks to him, he realizes Nietzsche's deep intelligence and becomes very fascinated by Nietzsche. And Nietzsche rejects his therapy. And this is being done in secret from Lou Salome. So Lou Salome kind of sets up the arrangement behind closed doors and gets Nietzsche to see Dr. Brewer because Nietzsche has a bunch of sicknesses that no doctor has been able to cure. And Lou Salome thinks Dr. Brewer is the most qualified to fix it. But despite, Brewer's qualifications, despite these many, connections, Nietzsche rejects the therapy. And so Dr. Brewer, still remains in contact with them, and Nietzsche gets a sort of a bout of sickness in his guest room. And so Brewer comes to take care of him, and the two men eventually agree to do mutual therapy on each other because Brewer realizes that Nietzsche has a lot of unconscious desires, doesn't use that word directly at the time, but realizes Nietzsche has a bunch of unconscious desires, and Nietzsche realizes the same of him, even though they're not using that term, right? Nietzsche desires Lou Salome, who he's very vicious at this point in time because he feels like she has screwed him over, and Dr. Brewer is intensely infatuated with one of his former patients that he typically refers to as Anna O.
Yeah, so let's unpack both of those. So the Anna O is a former patient who it seems like, in the way they describe it, was almost throwing herself at the doctor, and the doctor was rejecting the advances. He had a nurse at that point who'd been his nurse for like 10 years. His wife is jealous of both of them. The patient, Bertha, Annie O, comes out in a hysteria and goes, "I'm pregnant with the doctor's baby." And that's the inciting incident that makes Matilda, Brewer's wife, say, "You got to get rid of both of them. Matilda's got to go. Eva's got to go. You got too many attractive women around you."
Yeah.
And so Brewer transfers Anna O's stewardship, and he fires Eva and says, "I will help you get another job, but you can't work for me." And then on the other side, Lou Salome, Nietzsche, and Paul Ree, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Paul Ree had occasionally entered into this 3-person friendship working on a new way of being in the world.
Yeah, like a philosophy cult, communal. Like a 3-way philosophy cult.
Yeah, it's a good way to describe it.
No.
But Lou Salome, apparently, and this is accurate both in the text and out of it, it looks like Lou Salome held control and reins on these guys, but didn't really want to be with either one of them. She really wanted kind of this philosophy cult.
Yeah, you want to think, and both of them became interested in her because, I mean, this is what dudes do stereotypically.
That's what dudes do.
It's like, oh, cool, she's smart and she's showing interest in me. I wonder if she will. It's like that's the dude tendency, the desire that this book is pointing out towards. And I think this is one of those texts where it's like being male centric makes a lot of sense because I think dudes are a lot more explicit in their desires, but even with our explicitness, we can be quite unconscious. So it's one of those things where I think, not that men deal with desire more, but it's one of those things where it's a much more overt theme for men.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I kept coming back to this was the cultural aspect of all of these things and all of these behaviors, like the kind of simplistic way that they think about females in this, and kind of the way that females are taken care of. They don't have as much autonomy in this period of time. And so having Lou Salome being somebody with so much individual autonomy pushing through, and then on the other hand, Bertha with no autonomy being handed from doctor to doctor, you have these very interesting two polarly different people that are both in some way manipulating these men.
Yeah.
And that's not to say in a bad way. I'm just saying that they are using what they have in their situation to try and get where they want to be, but they're never engaged with as whole people by the men.
No, they're not engaged with as whole people, because the full engagement does not occur through the lens of desire. Even for Matilda, the wife, she's just seen as an object of stability. Yeah. Freud's wife is just seen as a model of that object of stability once again. So it's that it's almost the Kantian thing, the Kantian problem of treating people as means, agents, not ends. Right? Like, you're not treating them with agency; you're treating them for a particular benefit. And so the desire of women is seen as at least for these men, as a fulfillment of something that these men desire, right? Like, oh, if I can achieve this woman, if I can have this, individual, I have fulfilled myself in some way. That women are used as a product of self-aggrandizement and personal fulfillment of desire.
Yeah. And so one last note on the Paul Ree Nietzsche Salome triangle is there's a super famous photo from that. And every once in a while, a fake of it will pop up on Reddit where they say, oh, look, it's Nietzsche and Paul Ree nude and Salome's fondling them. And that's not the real photo.
No.
That would not have been taken as a photo.
No.
None of them could have handled that. That would have been comfortable. Yeah. It would not occur. But the real photo is actually very interesting and compelling because it has both Paul and Friedrich at the front of a wagon, and Salome is crouched down on the wagon with a riding crop. They're all fully dressed, but her on the back being the driver and them being her means is a fascinating image for what their relationship was.
Yeah, no, I mean, she was taking the reins of, Paul Ree was a successful individual in his own right. And, obviously Nietzsche has gone on to, be Nietzsche, not at the time, but, but nonetheless, right. It's and also she had personal interactions with Freud later down the line. They aren't mentioned in this text, but she interacted with the entire, German intellectual scene to a massive degree. So, she just had this tendency, about her, for sure. But I think one of the things, that this text does, focusing on the sort of phallocentric, nature of things, in a very, I like this, I believe it's in chapter 1, maybe chapter 2, disloyalty hidden by the Viennese god of decorum, right? That the god of decorum is brought up a lot, that like what these men are ultimately talking about is sex, right? Like that whole sort of Freudian thing of, sex is at the core of things, right? So it shows, this text shows time and time again, psychoanalysis in practice. We've talked about this being a dialogue, and we've talked about sort of the hidden reins and stuff. And so it really is just a psychoanalytic dialogue, presented to people. And and I think that's its sort of strength, is its psychological analysis, both when you read it on the surface and, analyze it to any sort of depth.
Yeah. And so I totally agree. I think that's where it is, and that's kind of where it shines. As a first-time reader, I will admit the opening is compelling. The therapy is complex. Like there are parts of it where it really slows you down, and it's not like this isn't like a beach read.
Yeah.
And then it speeds up again in the third act. But it does have a little bit of slowness in the middle because you are reading just discussions of ideas.
But I think
there's no
is important. it's a very important slowness, because that's how therapy works. You go in with a lot of initial energy, it slows down, you're kind of figuring out ideas slowly, and boom, eurekas, I mean, not that therapy is a project that ends necessarily, depending on the person, but that's a lot of times how an interaction with a new therapist works. There's a lot of energy, a lot of wow at the beginning, then there needs to be slow down, and then there's those eureka moments where things speed up.
And in that, I think that there's really good discussion in the text as well, and motivation for Brewer, because he's talking about how alive and compelled he was by Annie O / Bertha. But that wasn't just a desire base. Like he found her way of dumping all of this stuff out of her brain compelling, like what she called chimney sweeping, and they refer to it a couple of times. Mm-hmm. It's just really a confessional. It's relieving all of this pressure. And they compare it to that a couple of times when they start using it themselves between Nietzsche and Brewer to disgorge all of these feelings and experiences that you don't really talk about in a decorous society.
Yeah. And it makes, a special sense for someone like Nietzsche, whose father was a priest. And I believe that's mentioned in the text itself.
Yeah.
But, that being said, like, that metaphor is a lot clearer in the Christian context as opposed to the Jewish context. And so for someone in a Jewish context, being introduced to that sort of confessional idea may be, fascinating. Whereas for the Christian context, like, it's, I believe it's, Nietzsche is, very much talking about how his writing is, confessional and comes from, the self. He's very reticent in using that sort of language. And it does show that sort of history transition from the medieval ages where you would do confessional for some sort of metaphysical, higher purpose, but then that sort of system then becomes psychologized and, put into a science, right? So it's almost this interesting thing that, unconsciously it's, you're trying to justify sort of the old behaviors, but now you're putting it with these new sort of fancy languages. Oh, instead of it just being like confessional, oh no, this is the a talking cure, right? So it's there's this ready rationalization that's happening through the book again and again, where people want to come off rational and scientific and serious and stable, but they're dealing with a lot of instabilities, a lot of irrationalities again and again and again.
Yeah, and at one point when they're talking about it, like what it would be like, they call them angst doctors, and what it would be like to have angst doctors practicing, like, you've got kidney doctors and ear, nose, and throat doctors, and then you have an angst doctor. Yeah. And so it's an interesting kind of concept to identify the transition from this kind of informal thing to a more formalized thing. And I think that whole piece, that development of this is really interesting, because you start to remember that for all of the complications and developments that have come after it, like this is before CBT, this is before any of the really complicated stuff we have now, they're just trying to figure out how to get at that discomfort that lives within them and pull it out. Yeah. And kind of throw it on the floor and beat it to death.
Yeah. How do we kill, to use almost a Nietzschean metaphor, how do we kill the Viennese god of decorum, right? And actually get down to these anxieties that underlie. And, Freud's solution is, again, the desires that you are unaware of, but are still affecting your day-to-day life. For Nietzsche, it is very much in action. It's like, oh, you fix these sort of things by like committing to as much action as you possibly can. For Dr. Brewer, it's a realization of desire, which at first he does not think is unconscious, but then is convinced, by his student as the text goes along. And one of those things, for, and they have very kind of different, approaches, right? For Nietzsche, it's like, how do you, get past sort of these underlying things? Well, you act out the things that you want to do. And this is a solution he offers to Brewer. Oh, you're desiring, Bertha, Anna. Oh, just go there, go to her. Where Freud is like, no. What you do is you figure out these sort of things, and that, you identify these things, and then you just kind of, hypnotize them out. You kind of just kind of like try to, kind of like shake them out. Whereas for Brewer, he kind of finds that good sort of middle point of like, okay, like how can I, overcome these desires while acting in a way that's reasonable, right? He kind of comes to the sort of liberal kind of solution between the two.
Yeah. So let's talk about his desire, because I think that in it's appropriate and it's written well, but reading it and reflecting on, like, the guy that wrote it was born in the 30s. So he's got some idea of kind of the conservative spaces that this moved in. He's got some idea of the decorum that was pressing. And so reading through Brewer's infatuation with Bertha, it's not very complicated.
No.
Like, it's very simple infatuation. It's this very, I think about her and her body and what I could do with it. And did I miss out when she was presenting herself to me? And he's very much in that space. There's no complexity to Bertha as a person. The one piece I mentioned earlier about liking that she chimney swept, one of the big reasons he likes it is because she'll do it with her head on his lap.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of stuff there where even when he brings this thing of value away from the relationship, it's not any credit to Bertha.
No. And it's in contrast to Matilda, who's not as like, who's a little more like her own thing. And is like, come watch the kids, come do this with me. Yeah. Where it's like for Bertha, Dr. Brewer can just have control, can just have what he wants because she just throws herself at him.
Yeah. And it's almost like she's a vehicle to target lust. Yes. Like, she very much is written that way and kind of spaced that way for Brewer. And in reading it and reading like his vision of her and the way he perceives her, whether or not that's true, because we never actually meet Bertha in the text, unless I missed that.
No. So. She's not. I mean, she's not met. She's talked about.
There's one point where he's in a hypnotic trance, and it's a really good point. We'll talk about it in a minute, but that's as close as you get. So we never actually meet or see Bertha act or behave or do. It's all filtered through Brewer's perception of Annio Bertha. And so in reading that, the thing that kept coming back to me is the current kind of right-wing Andrew Tate manosphere kind of incel stuff, where it's this perception of women as that kind of space.
That isn't what he takes, though. That's not what the final answer of the text is. If anything, that's Nietzsche's solution. Agree. Nietzsche's solution is Andrew Tate.
Oh, fair. Okay. Yeah, I can see that crossover, but he ends up being wrong and almost needing Brewer's take to walk him through. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is why kind of like, which also speaks to the 1930s though. Yeah. Right. Like, to be fair, Nietzsche after this point in his career actually becomes more entrenched in that position of assert your power. Right. Like that's, whether you want to say that The Will to Power is a completely accurate text or not, based off the edits of his sister, we can see things alluding to that The Will to Power becomes a more abrasive concept in his thinking, and that he becomes more entrenched with Dionysus. And so, if anything, this is not where Nietzsche actually goes at the end of this point in period of time. If anything, he gets more entrenched in the sort of do what you want, go after your desires, assert your power, whatever that power may be. The world is a clash of power against power.
So I agree with you, like in that scope and how stuff goes and where Nietzsche kind of sits in that. But while I was reading it, I do think that this is a valuable text for people that are dealing with infantilizing their desires and lusts.
Yes.
Because it pushes through. And I was struck by the conclusion and how well they pivot it. It felt controlled and accurate. And I appreciated that. But in the lead up to that, the perceptual stuff is very much in that Gamergate incel kind of community.
Well, problem,
just the middle bits, right? The middle and the opener.
Yeah. And the problem is almost solved through Freudian means, where Nietzsche's just like, wait a sec, your mom's name is Bertha, right? And so there's almost this and
your daughter's name is Bertha.
Yeah, this like Electra complex happening with is happening in multiple sort of areas. It's this sort of very Freudian thing that happens in that regard. And weirdly enough, Freud is seen as closer to being right. Like Freud, we mentioned. Nietzsche and his brother-in-law being a foil, but Freud is also a foil. I mean, Dr. Brewer is constantly, proven wrong in this text, even though he's the most renowned doctor in all of Vienna. He's constantly, put down. He's, he gets kind of demoted, but ultimately he has to be put down in order to kind of like rise above kind of the rest of them and come up with the sort of sound sort of stability and kind of, oddly enough, I would say unhistorically accurate, is credited as being the father of psychoanalysis, right? He emerges as the one with the true solution. He's the one that kind of solves all the issues for himself and, the others around him.
Yeah. And, Freud's kind of put in a vacuum in that space, and that's just public consciousness. But you start looking at it, and everything from Alfred Adler was one of his biggest influences. He did a lot of psychoanalysis before. Freud did a lot of stuff with hypnosis. Mesmer was insane, but we kind of leave him out of it because he thought he was actually magical. So he didn't think I was doing therapy. He's like, you're actually, look, I can do magic.
Well, or even more obviously, Nietzsche in some sense could also be credited as a founding figure of psychoanalysis too, which is why it's very important to include him in this text, because, he was doing psychoanalytic work kind of not on accident necessarily. He called himself a psychologist, but, he's one of the most influential figures on psychology without being included in any sort of intro to psychology class.
Yeah. See, I'm going to sneeze. I'm not going to sneeze. I felt it. And it was like, no, you don't get one. Unsatisfactory.
The unconscious sneeze. The subconscious sneeze.
My ego and my achoo.
It all comes out at once.
It's an interplay. So the middle bit where they're having all these conversations is where a lot of this psychoanalysis and kind of discussion and talk therapy is portrayed. And it's good. It's a very good discussion. In it, though, there are some things that popped out to me in their discussions. One of them is when they're walking in the cemetery, and all of his Brewer's Jewish ancestors are buried in like a Christian cemetery because they're trying to be like more like this is to your decorum again.
Yes.
And he places a smooth, flat stone on top of the tombstones. And Nietzsche asks him why. He goes, well, it's my own little Pascal's wager. And Pascal's wager, for anybody that's listening and isn't familiar, is the idea that, well, why don't you just believe in God? That way, if he is real, then you get to go to heaven and have all the benefits. And the argument against Pascal's wager is, well, what if this is the wrong God? What if it's actually Ganesh? Then I'm still going. So they do that one. And then after that, a little while, Nietzsche is pushing him to think about the infinite and that everything that has happened will happen again and has happened before. And he calls it Nietzsche's wager. And I thought that was an interesting kind of parallel to draw. Is Nietzsche's wager a thing in the text? Well, I'm not familiar with that.
It's a
concept.
Thing in the gay science where it's the demon of eternal recurrence comes to you at night and goes, all right, man, are you going to, if you had to live this life over and over again, right? Like a demon tells you that, it's like, hey, you're going to live this life over and over again. Would you be ecstatic or saddened, right? And that's the wager. The wager is whether, you should live your life as if you would want to relive this life an infinite number of times, that you always reincarnate into the same life again and again and again. And so it's not formally called Nietzsche's wager, but in a sense, that's what it is. And it's not a wager on, sort of some metaphysical infinite. It's a wager on the earthly infinite, not even as an actual occurrence. It's very hard to figure out whether he thought this was an actual structure of reality or not in his later career. But in the point of the gay science, it very much seems like a hypothetical where it's like, live your life as if, you were, condemned, not in a bad sense, but just condemned to live it an infinite number of times.
That's interesting because in the text in the book, it felt like he believed, the way it was written, it felt like he believed that everything that's ever happened has already happened and will happen again the same over and over.
Yeah, it's not
that may have just been
at the time. Okay. I mean, it seems he transitions into this once writing Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Like, he seems to be flirting a little bit more with it as an actual metaphysical principle of reality. But at this point, when the text makes place, it would probably be a transition period between the two ideas for sure.
Okay, because they talk about that a lot, where Nietzsche is kind of, his head is full of Zarathustra, and he's trying to get to the point where he can birth that child of a text into the world.
Yes.
And he's stuck, especially because of his obsession with Salome and his headaches that he has, his dyspepsia. Like, he's just kind of a mess as a person, like as a physical body. It's not working great. So after they have this giant long discussion and stuff over the course of like months, it kind of comes to this head with that conversation where he's going, you have to figure out what you want. You have to do this. And you also have to be willing to decide, did you make all these choices because this is where you wanted to be? Or were these choices that the world and society and decorum kind of thrust upon you? Would you want to be married to Matilda if you had a choice? Or did you marry Matilda because everybody made you make that choice? And so the trigger for like the end push is Nietzsche saying, you have to be willing to not be married to Matilda.
Yeah.
And then it kind of gets read. I think he reads it. Brewer reads it a little bit wrong.
Well, yeah, he doesn't take the sort of the wager, right? Because we have a hypothetical, another hypothetical, and then a third hypothetical, right? And whether Brewer reads it wrong or not, all of these things are playing on Pascal's sort of notions of probability theory, right? Like, Pascal was very famously into probability theory, where, I mean, this isn't something that Nietzsche was into in the same degree, but all of these things are playing, on a sense of, probability, on, circumstance. They're playing on a lot of what ifs. And in a sense, almost kind of, there was a section in chapter 9 that I don't have the exact wording, but almost comes off as the desire for desire. It almost comes off very Lacanian. Obviously, this is all well before Lacan, but nonetheless, it's that desire for desire. And so you have Brewer here kind of confusing the desire for desire with what should be desired itself, for sure, right? And Nietzsche's doing the same thing. He's unable to birth Zarathustra. He's unable to get his true desire because he's caught in this cyclical cycle of desire for desire, as alluded to in chapter 9 of the text.
Well, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but it's definitely where it lands. Because then it does. This is where the book does a really clever thing too. Right after this confrontation between the two of them, Brewer's messed up. He's toast inside, and so then it cuts from that scene to him in the morning leaving his wife.
Yeah,
and I have to leave. I'm packing up. I'm going to take this much clothes. He goes and tells his brother-in-law I'm leaving, kisses his kids goodbye, and gets on a train and decides, but doesn't decide, to go see Bertha.
Yeah.
And when or Annie O. And when he goes to see her, she's walking with a current doctor, and he sits and watches them, and he sees all the things that he's remembered her doing with him, her doing with another doctor.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, that's his point of cure. That's the point when he divests from this desire. He leaves there. He goes to Eva, his former nurse, and asks about, like, there was this one time where you said you'd do anything to help me with my problems. Did you really mean that? And she's like, I don't remember it. You fired me. It was awful. And Eva just calls him out on the boards.
Yeah.
And then he leaves and goes to, I think then he goes to Venice. Maybe that's where I got it from.
Yeah.
Because he does go then. And he's thinking about opening a restaurant, and he's going to get new clothes. He gets shaved. He looks in the mirror. He's really old. And then it goes bink. And that whole thing, that whole day, that weeks that he'd gone through was a hypnotic session that he had Sigmund run for him.
So it's hypnotic session. All right. They got
it's not.
They got some DMT, in the clock.
I need you to take these mushrooms and listen to my voice. Yeah, it's not a hypnotic session. That's really, hallucinations aren't like that. But they use it as
Yeah, it's magical
mechanism.
thinking. It's the oh my God, why am I forgetting the figure used earlier that believed he was magic?
Mesmer.
Mesmer. Yeah, I was literally mesmerized into like a whole nother, sort of world. And yes, my brain does go to those things because of my love for the Grateful Dead for sure. But none the less, yeah, it creates a hypothetical scenario. It's almost this thought experiment being acted out.
Right.
And it shows that desire is not always mutual. The just because you desire something, right, doesn't mean the other does. And you have a bunch of this is why the framing of men is great. I think there's a sort of, I mean, everyone can have this assumption to degrees. Obviously, it's not just unique to men, but because of societies historically being set up in a very patriarchal manner, it's like, oh no, this is a male desire, therefore I should have it. I'm a man, I'm in charge, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's maybe going away a little bit now, but nonetheless, it certainly existed to a large degree here. And so there you have all these men assuming, oh well, of course they're going to feel the same way about me. Of course it's going to be like this. And this is something I think Nietzsche has understood well, is like he was given the short end of the stick. Father dies early. His sister's a literal, racist, anti-Semite. He's given all the sicknesses, in the world. Women don't want him, right? So it's like Nietzsche has understood. It's like, yeah, you go after your desires, but the world is not going to respond as you desire. And this is something why he sets up a situation of, as Nietzsche has sometimes put, the loneliest of lonelies, right? Where it's like, no, imagine a situation where you're left with nothing but yourself, is what he seems to be trying to get to, like you confronting the demon alone. But instead, what he does is take, Nietzsche's other aspect of that advice of chase your desires. He doesn't listen to the full thing. If like, for Nietzsche, he thinks you have to use a Kendrick Lamar line, you have to, strip the ego from the bottom. Then you go and then you can know your desires from there and go after those things.
Yeah. And this is the part too, like watching this like turn. This is where I was thinking again about the incel culture and the kind of really right-wing manosphere thing, is they see this and they see other people's desire and they get mad about it.
Yes.
Instead of having the processing that Brewer does. Brewer takes it and processes it and reanalyzes, unpacks, and starts going, okay, what happens if I think about Bertha now? Okay, I'm okay. What if I think about Bertha in a more compromising position? Oh, I'm okay. Mm-hmm. Like her desire, and being able to see that her desire can shift and belong somewhere else, and that's not tragedy, is his absolution, is his curative.
Yeah, it's not what Freud was trying to do with the session originally and trying to erase it out and hypnotize it out. Instead, he's able to recontextualize, right? He's able to find, once again, that balance between the two, between sort of, Freud's sort of erasure strategy and Nietzsche's sort of strategy of, Nike, just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's nice about this too is that it reads like Brewer set up Sigmund with instruction. He goes, hey, Sigmund, put me under. Here's the things to say to me. If I try to climb up, try and keep me down. And so it feels like Brewer came up with this in the text. It's Brewer came up with it on his own, which is, it's okay. I'll let it go. But then go ahead. You got something there?
Yeah, but it doesn't, it seems that like Freud constantly rebels against his teacher. Like this seems to be something throughout the text where it's like there's this, I mean, that's very obvious in the disagreement between the unconscious, that Freud is not just willing to give in. So we don't even know if Freud followed the instructions properly. It could just be Brewer's belief. And so I like to leave that, kind of speculation open, where it's like, were the instructions followed perfectly by Freud or not? And, there's an argument there that maybe he didn't.
Fair. I hadn't thought of that, and I'll take that as a new subtext. I do like how they pivot this, though, then, and have Brewer come back to Freud and is like, holy crap, I'm cured. And Freud's like, or excuse me, Nietzsche is, what the hell? What do you mean you're cured? And he goes through and he explains. And as he's explaining, you finally get this break in Nietzsche where he confesses and goes, hey, I have this whole thing, Salome's on my mind. I can't get rid of it. And the curative in this, and I thought this was a great literary device too, the curative in this is Brewer talking through all of his experience with Salome, and Nietzsche recognizing that that's how she behaved with me. And that's just how she behaves with other people. Yeah. That wasn't my special thing. And so they have the same problem. One of them gets it through hypnosis and one of them gets it through a discussion with a person who experienced it. It's a really interesting kind of turn on that kind of culmination for this whole idea of dealing with desire and infatuation.
Yeah, and if anything, it gives Nietzsche some like benefit, right? It proves Nietzsche's intelligence over Brewer again and again. That like Brewer needs this whole like hypnotic state where he can literally see it happening, and Nietzsche just needs it like not even explained directly, just indirectly. He can see it through somebody else and imagine and literally view in his head. Oh yeah, that Lou would do that with Paul Ray, and Lou would do that with this person and this person. I wasn't her special little boo thing. You know, that wasn't me.
Yeah, and that's a great kind of. It's a really nice pinnacle for the book because it does have these two resolutions, and it also has like a making amends where Brewer confesses that this all originated because of Salome. You might feel like this is your fourth big betrayal, but I did it originally for her, and then I did it for you, and now I'm doing this for you. And it's an interesting kind of friendship reconciliation after deceit.
Yes,
like where they almost become stronger people together than they were before that.
Well, yeah, and the deceit also. There's a triple deceit from Nietzsche's own sister, who's trying to make her seem like a bad person, and Nietzsche. Is not even against deceit, right? I mean, he's confused by the prospect of it, right? Like even though his sister's telling him again and again, and he's frustrated by it, he seems to be not frustrated necessarily by the act of deceit in and of itself. He is mad that it's deceit against him, right? Like he because he has this struggle with loneliness, he doesn't want people to deceive him. He wants just anyone, around him. And, and he even as his sister is talking smack about Lou Salome, he's not even fully believing of it. He's concerned about her deceit. And one of his problems that he has again and again in the book is that he feels people are deceiving him. He doesn't trust Dr. Brewer fully. He doesn't trust Lou Salome. He doesn't trust his sister, fully. He has, he talks about, he assumes that his friends are going to leave him at some point again and again and again. And it's only through, Brewer giving him the realization of, hey, people may care about you, but they may not care about you in the capacity you want them to care about you. Only is Nietzsche able to move forward with his relationships as they stand.
Yeah, and I think that's a valid kind of spot for it to kind of wrap up, because I think that. So I think that in thinking about this book and coming into it, like I don't think I would have seen this on the shelf and gone, oh, what's he crying about? Right. I'm like, hey, I'm going to read it. But that you brought it to me and I read it, I would have liked to have read this when I was like undergrad and first starting to dive into this stuff, because it gives such nice color and character to people that are just kind of ideas to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like all this stuff, all the Nietzsche stuff, a lot of the Freud stuff, even when you get into the others that we're mentioning, all these different philosophers, they're so much reduced to the information and the ideas, and then you start to decontextualize those ideas and they become modernized and added onto, and you forget the context in which they arose. And I think this book does a very good job of contextualizing specifically Nietzsche's ideas, process, and put together.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, when I have my master's in philosophy and bachelor's in history, and the history stuff I didn't realize how beneficial it would be for my philosophy master's, because, my other peers, smarter people than I, but nonetheless, they had the ideas down better, but they didn't realize the emergence of certain ideas. I remember at one point in a class on Nietzsche, funny enough, it was kind of comparing the Bible to Nietzsche, and we would read the Bible for a period of time, and then at the end of the semester was Nietzsche's critiques of the Bible. And at one point, there's a discussion that's brought up. It's like the Jews are now under the control of Cyrus, right? And and the first thing they do is build a temple. And the guy asks, well, why aren't they building a wall? It's like, well, no, they were under an empire that was protecting of them. And it's just like, wait, what do you mean? What empire? Like what's happening with this empire stuff? It's like, no, like here's the, so it's one of those things where it's like, again, very smart people, but just with the lack of history, they didn't understand the religious freedom of the Persian Empire and, the safety and protection that could provide under the larger empire. And so, I think this happens a lot with ideas where we kind of look back on people and go, oh, come on, how did you come up with that? That's so obvious now. But it's like, no, because ideas build up from each other. And there's plenty of ideas we're probably missing out now because of our own focuses and historical context, for sure.
I was listening to some podcasters talk about Charles Darwin, and the guy was seasick all the time. He couldn't figure out how to use a hammock. He loved to eat. He was part of the Glutton Society. So he ate pretty much every animal he encountered, from the Galapagos tortoise to finches. You're like, let's try it. We found a new animal. Let's see what it tastes like.
Yum.
And the guy comes across as this rarefied dude, with the long white beard and the bald pate. But when he's sailing on the Beagle, he would try to get into his hammock feet first because he didn't understand how hammocks worked. And it's like, man, we're missing a lot of context on a bunch of these dudes.
I love the fact that Kant had scheduled parties. That's one of my favorite philosophy historical facts, where he was a party animal, but it's like, oh no, quickly, it is 8:30 p.m. We must play music now. Oh shoot, it is 9:45 p.m. We must do a discussion hour. It's just this very simultaneously, you don't think of Kant being the host of a party, but then it's also very much in Kant's personality to just formalize and structure things. And it's those little actions that really tell you a lot about someone's form of thought, which is something Nietzsche brings up even in this text, that all philosophy is a matter of psychology and behavior, and these things are reflections of one another, that you cannot separate one's actions from their form of thinking.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I enjoyed the book. I'm excited to see the film. That's going to be our next bit.
Yep.
Before we go, are there any big themes or big events in the text that we missed or didn't cover?
I mean, there is a lot of stuff, but
we got two more hours.
But ultimately, one of the things that's interesting about this is, if we can set up the sort of movie part, is that I think the movie actually doesn't.
You're not going to spoil it for me. I know how the.
No. But I think the movie does a pretty decent job at following the text. However, while the text is well received, the movie gets clowned on. Most of the videos reviewing, the movie are clowning on it, which I didn't get that reputation. I don't feel that same sort of thing. So, but. It's one of those things where it's by reputation. It's seen as a good book accompanied by a sort of garbage movie. I'm
excited. If it's a bad movie, I love bad movies.
And that's one of the reasons I brought it forth, where it's because it's the comparison is not just, in regards to the way it presents ideas, but also translation of mediums and why one is received well versus why another is received garbagely.
Well, and in just thinking through the plot and the points that hit, I think the only spot where you'd really have to kind of truncate a bunch of stuff is their discussions, because there's so much discussion that it'd be a 2-hour them sitting there and you'd have nothing else. But if you can truncate that, hit some of the high points and montage it, maybe. I don't know. I'll watch the movie and we'll come back and we'll talk about it.
I haven't seen it in years. So actually, actually this was my, I did the reverse thing where I saw the movie first, then read the text. And so, maybe the movie shaped my reading of the text, but
interesting.
You gotta work with what you got.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So the last thing before we go, do you want to plug your pluggables, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you and get more of your ideas?
Well, actually just Google search my name, my full name, Anthony David Vernon, and you will find everything from poems to random articles. I don't have social media or anything like that. I know I'm so cool and different. I'm not like other girls.
No, you're on, you have Medium posts though. You have a bunch of stuff written on Medium, right?
Is that social media?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know how the orb expands or controls us. Yeah.
Don't know how, but yes, I am on Medium, but, I prefer to just Google search my full name, Anthony David Vernon. I'm the first Anthony David Vernon to come up, and you can find just this piece, that piece, whatever.
do Google his full name, because if you Google Anthony Vernon, there's a guy at like King's College London.
I wish I was that guy. Like, that guy's smart.
Yeah, this is the American version. So
yeah, the guy who wears the Grateful Dead shirt, not the not the
it's a solid
Londoner.
Well, with that, thank you all for listening. We're going to catch up with you guys on the next episode when we've watched the movie, and then we talk about who plays the roles, who played them well. If we get a good Salome, I'm hoping for that. If we get a good Brewer, Nietzsche should just be super neurotic. I'm excited to see. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Adios.